Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. I'd like to start by reading a short passage from this book. This is a Tibetan teaching. It's the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation on the nature of mind. Mind in its true state. When one seeks mind in its true state, it is found to be quite intelligible, although invisible. In its true state, mind is naked, immaculate, not made of anything, being of the voidness, clear, vacuous, without duality, transparent, timeless, uncompounded, unimpeded, colorless, not realizable as a separate thing, but as the unity of all things, yet not composed of them, of one taste and transcendent over differentiation. Nor is one's own mind separable from other minds. To realize the quintessential being of the one mind is to realize the immutable at one-ment of the Trikaya. The mind being as the uncreated and the voidness, the Dharmakaya, and as the vacuous and self-radiant, the Sambhogakaya, and as the unobscured, shining for all living creatures, the Nirmanakaya, is the primordial essence wherein its three divine aspects are one. If the yogic application of this wisdom is to be thorough, one will comprehend that which has just been set forth above. Mind is non-created. Mind in its true nature being non-created and self-radiant, how can one, without knowing the mind, assert that mind is created? There being in this yoga nothing objective upon which to meditate, how can one, without having ascertained the true nature of mind by meditation, assert that the mind is created? Mind in its true state being reality, how can one, without having discovered one's own mind, assert that mind is created? Mind in its true state being undoubtedly ever existing, how can one, without having seen the mind face to face, assert that mind is created? The thinking principle being of the very essence of mind, how can one, without having sought and found it, assert that mind is created? Mind being transcendent over creation, and thus partaking of the uncreated, how can one assert that mind is created? Mind being in its primordial, unmodified naturalness, non-created, as it should be taken to be, and without form, how can one assert that it is created? Inasmuch as mind can also be taken to be devoid of quality, how can one venture to assert that it is created? The self-born, quality-less mind, being like the three voids, undifferentiated, unmodified, how can one assert that mind is created? Mind being without objectivity and causation, self-originated, self-born, how can one, without having endeavored to know mind, assert that mind is created? Inasmuch as divine wisdom dawns in accordance with its own time, and one is emancipated, how can opponents of these teachings assert that it is created? Mind being as it is, of this nature, and thus unknowable, how can one assert that it is created? The one mind being verily of the voidness and without any foundation, one's mind is likewise as vacuous as the sky. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. Being of the voidness and thus not to be conceived as having beginning or ending, self-born wisdom has in reality been shining forever, like the sun's essentiality, itself unborn. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. Divine wisdom is undoubtedly indestructible, unbreakable, like the ever-flowing current of a river. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. Being merely a flux of instability, like the air of the firmament, objective appearances are without power to fascinate and fetter. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. All appearances are verily one's own concepts, self-conceived in the mind. like reflections seen in a mirror. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. Arising of themselves and being naturally free like the clouds in the sky, all exterior appearances verily fade away into their own respective places. To know whether this be so or not, look within thine own mind. This self-created clear light, eternally unborn, is a parentless babe of wisdom. Wondrous is this. Being non-created, it is natural wisdom. Wondrous is this. Not having known birth, it knows not death. Wondrous is this. Although it is total reality, there is no perceiver of it. Wondrous is this. Although wandering in samsara, it remains undefiled by evil. Wondrous is this. Although seeing the Buddha, it remains unallied to good. Wondrous is this. Although possessed by all beings, it is not recognized. Wondrous is this. Those not knowing the fruit of this yoga seek other fruit. Wondrous is this. Although the clear light of reality shines within one's own mind, the multitude look for it elsewhere. Wondrous is this. So in every tradition of Buddhism, it's always been a central theme and preoccupation is the nature of mind. And this is Tibetan text expressing things in a very Tibetan way, very powerfully, I think, in the elusive nature of mind. Most of the Zen koans are essentially ways of trying to get the practitioner to know their own mind. And this is the essence of all meditation, is to try and look within, examine the nature of your own mind. In Thai forest tradition, they talk a lot about the chitta as the one who knows. In Thai, they use the phrase puru, the one who knows, the knowing principle, this subjective knowing mind. And when you're able to clarify within your own mind the nature of the knowing principle and the known, clarify the mind and mental object, then this is a major breakthrough into understanding the mind, the self, and all reality. Beings wander endlessly in samsara, taking birth after birth in multiple forms because of ignorance, because of not seeing, not knowing, not understanding intuitively the nature of what's happening. Yeah. Conditioned reality has an endless repertoire of forms, constantly bedazzled and bewildered by objects, alternately lost to desire and lost to fear and loathing. We go back and forth. And we identify with these objects, and this is the first mistake. Mental objects or external objects, if we identify with them, if we see them as me and mine, then we're lost. We're caught in the cycle of becoming. So the inner work, the important practice, is always to clarify the nature of our own interior reality. This is a way of becoming wise and becoming free. Until we can know the nature of our own mind, we're not free. We're enslaved by the mental formations. we're caught up in desire and fear, and anxiety and worry and depression and all the other mental states. You know, we see them as dependently arisen, conditioned, and ultimately void. And we see that they don't affect the knowing principle at all. That which knows is not affected by the objects. Just remember the story of the sixth Zen patriarch. This is one of my favorite Zen stories. The poor, raggedy, ignorant hillbilly who come to this famous monastery. And they identify him as an ignorant southerner. This is the prejudice of the sophisticated, urbanized northern Chinese against the rural, backwards, southerners. And so they identify him as an ignorant southerner when he shows up, and they put him in the cellar scrubbing pots. And as the fifth patriarch is getting near the end of his life, and he wants to choose a successor, so he announces he's going to have a contest. Everybody has to write a short poem, a stanza, expressing their understanding of Zen. And he'll pick one. And so this fellow who's going to become the sixth patriarch, he's going through the hall one day and he sees all the wall plastered with these posters with the poems on them. And he's illiterate, he can't read and write. So he asks a monk to explain to him what's going on. He tells him that, this is the contest to pick the successor to the fifth patriarch. And he says, well, who's the leading contender? And he says, oh, everybody's pretty sure that so-and-so is going to win this year poem. Well, read it out to me. And he says, the mind is like a mirror, and every day we polish it diligently so that no dust will settle. And then he says, oh, that's nonsense. It's rubbish. Here, write this down. There is no mirror nor dust beside, so what is there to polish? And he says, put that up. That's my entry. And of course he gets picked and causes a huge scandal, and he has to go into hiding. But this is the expression of the understanding of the empty, void nature of mind and object. We tend to think of meditation as like polishing the mirror so no dust settles. But this is objectifying. This is making the mind into a thing, and the dust of defilement into things, and the meditation as a working on things. And it's not doesn't make any sense. It's not right. The mind is utterly void. The objects are utterly void. So there's nothing to be done. So the perfect meditation is just being, not doing. Just sitting there in a natural state. That's not intuitively easy for people. So over the time, the tradition has developed various techniques and methods for trying to access that. For example, mindfulness of breathing or vipassana meditation. These are different ways of trying to access that natural state of just being. In the very first verse of the Dhammapada, the Buddha said that mind is the chief, mind is the forerunner. The body follows the mind like the cart follows the ox. This way of viewing things, the primacy of mind, is now coming full circle. I was just reading a blog post on the Scientific American website talking about some new experimental verification of the observer effect, which has been a puzzle in physics since the 1920s. The famous example is the two-slit experiment, where you put a beam of light through two slits, and it's either makes a wave pattern or it makes a particle pattern, depending on how you do the measuring. And somehow the beam seems to know what you're going to do. And it even works if you put the light through one photon at a time. You can make it do a wave form. So this article was by a physicist named Bernardo Kastrup, and he proposed a model of how it all works that comes very close to one particular interpretation of Buddhism, the Yogacara school of Buddhism, that teaches that only mind exists. Everything is a mental phenomenon. He says that there is no real external reality until it's perceived, and that reality is perception, which is something we always emphasize in the Buddhist teachings, is that perception is all you have of the external world. He goes a little further than that and says that, agreeing with this Tibetan text, he says that the universe is essentially all mind. It's that only the fundamental, in his phrase, he said that every metaphysical system must have ontological primitive, meaning that's the basic building block, something you can't analyze further than. And he says that it must be mind. And this actually agrees also with early quantum mechanical physicists like Max Planck, who said that it all comes down in the end to mind. You can't get behind consciousness. So in Kastrup's model, he proposes that there is a universal mind, and that individual beings have their separate minds within that. And he uses it's kind of an odd analogy, but he says that using it, he calls them alters, like in psychology. If you have somebody who has multiple personality disorder, their partial personalities are called alters, and there's a limited communication between the alter and the big mind. So he says that individual beings are like alters within the universal mind. And to me, the interesting detail was that the physical universe exists only as a interface or a membrane between the personal mind and the universal mind, and it is perception. And this extrapolates from the idea of the Copenhagen interpretation idea of a probability wave. He says the probability wave is mind, and that the individual mind also has its field, and the interface between the two creates an interference pattern that is perceived as physical reality. So that one of the correlates or implications of this Kastrup's model is that every individual being has their own universe, their own physical universe. But the thing that they all have in common is the universal mind. That's the commonality. And apparently he claims, I don't know enough to verify his statement, but he says that this model is entirely consistent with all the experimental and mathematical findings of quantum mechanics to date. And that and I think he's quite obviously right when he says that no model based on naive realism can work. The idea that there is a fixed external reality that we're all that's there whether we do the experiment or not, whether we look or not. Whether we exist or not. There's a external universe reality. He says no model of quantum mechanics works with that. So it's interesting to me that in this late date in history that the physical scientists are coming around, and have been really since the 1920s. They've been coming around to the idea that we can't leave consciousness or mind out of the equation, and it's actually primary. It's actually an ontological primitive. And it's kind of ironic that this way of looking at things has come about in the physical sciences much more radically and much further, pushing these ideas much further than the biological sciences or modern psychology. And in the ancient Eastern way of dealing with questions of reality was always to go inward. This was a major difference between the two great philosophical civilizations of the few centuries BC were Greece and India. And the Greeks always tried to understand reality by looking outwards, studying the stars, measuring weights of metals, and these kind of external, trying to understand reality externally, paying attention to the object. Whereas India primarily looked inward, trying to understand the nature of mind. And this was an endeavor that was going on for quite some time before the Buddha. Indian yogis were wandering and practicing austerities and practicing meditation and contemplation, trying to understand the nature of mind, the nature of being, nature of consciousness. And the Buddha made the really radical breakthrough in seeing the emptiness of all things, understanding the void nature, see the voidness. So actually looking at the same thing from a different angle, in a way, seeing the interrelatedness of all things. The idea that nothing exists from its own side. This interdependence of all things, this is also something that in the modern physical approach is coming to the forefront. And this Bernardo Kastrup, he brings this up in his article too. He says one of the problems with interpreting the experiments is what he calls contextuality. That the traditional way of pre-quantum mechanical classical physics way of interpreting an experiment was non-contextual. The idea was you had a physical system and you could make changes in it and observe what happened. But he makes the point there's no way to escape the contextuality, that the experimenter is part of the process. And in fact, the whole universe is an interrelated system, and isolating out a part of it to do an experiment is only kind of an artificial exercise, and you can't fully understand what's happening unless you take in the context, which includes the conscious awareness of the experimenter. So our naive way of perceiving things, the way we perceive things from perspective of ordinary mind is to see the world composed of solid, discrete objects that react on each other. But this is an artificial way of seeing. It's a product of our perception, that we perceive the world as being made of things. In reality, no thing is actually a standalone unit, a self-existent. There's no self-essence. In the Indian philosophical language, it's swabhava, own essence. There's actually only interrelated nodes in a network, an infinite matrix, a network of being. And each node is only exists as a reflection of all the other nodes. It has no meaning. It has no reality if it's isolated out as a unit. Although that's what we tend to do with our perception. This is both a perceptual and a philosophical error of naive realism. And also a product of the naive mind is to be unaware of the process of knowing itself, which is the most wondrous and a miracle of being that we actually have experienced, that we know. And it's fundamental. It's the primary reality, is the knowing. That's why the Thai forest masters like Ajahn, all they taught was being in the knowing mind. Ajahn Mahabua calls it your true home. The chitta, the awareness, which is absolutely fundamental to our being. It's basically what we are, is the knowing. And the knowing is not affected by anything. Now, this is the great trick to discover. That we're plagued. We can be plagued by our mental states. People suffer a lot with their mental states. Unfulfilled desire, with fear, with anger. All these things are suffering. And there's a huge degree of suffering in the world is purely mental. And if we can see that's not what we are, you can see that the knowing mind is not affected by any of that. The knowing mind's aware of that. There's another Zen anecdote similar to the one about the sixth patriarch. It's two monks arguing over the nature of mind. And one says mind is like a bright mirror set up in a high place, and it illuminates and reflects the 10,000 things. And the other monk says, well, that's close, but it's not quite right. The mind is like a mirror set up in a high place, and it illuminates the 10,000 things, but nothing is reflected in the face of the mirror thereby. In the Anguttara Nikaya, there's one short passage that says the nature of mind is radiant. elsewhere it says that the enlightened mind has no boundary and finds no footing. Unobstructed. There's a metaphor in one of the suttas where the enlightened mind is like a sunbeam coming through a window, and it strikes the wall, and then you can see the reflection on the wall. You can see the bright spot on the wall. But if there's no wall, where does the sunbeam land? This is like the enlightened mind. It's unobstructed. I say enlightened mind makes it sound like it's something very distant and exotic and an extreme development, but it could also be called a natural state of mind. The uncorrupted primordial mind. The metaphor that's very very common in particularly in Tibetan tradition is the mind as sky, and it's like the vast vacuous open space of the sky, and it's always there even on a cloudy day. You just don't see it, and the clouds are like your thoughts and emotions and all, the stuff, the objects in the mind, obscuring the empty, vacuous, infinite nature of the mind. So just to conclude, to wrap it up, bring it back to a practical point, make it the primary theme of practice is to try and know the nature of mind. Try and access that primordial knowing mind. Try to just be.